Begin. Man, I don't like that voice. Okay. Okay. So, everybody, welcome to History Matters and So Does Coffee. I have now very conveniently turned away from Carolee's wonderful counting of which episode we are. I know that we are the 65th episode overall this week. Is it the 25th episode of the second season and the 65th episode overall? I think that's where we are.
26th episode.
26. I was close for memorizing it. Okay. Anyway, that's admirable. I pat us all on the back for keeping this going for 65 weeks. At any rate, welcome. Today, not surprisingly, I actually spent a day or so thinking, what are we going to talk about? And I'm slow. So it took me like until Thursday to be like, July 4th is coming up. What am I thinking? So we are going to talk about July 4th, although it's going to actually be a discussion of July 4th with some deeper meanings and ideas and messages implanted. So it's not just going to be, don't we love July 4th? So, but before I go into all of the things I have prepared for you that I want to say, first, I turn to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain the rules of the game.
And it is wonderful to be back for everybody for at least 1 week and to see everybody again. I missed you last week, and thank you for allowing me to pop in. What's that?
At least 1 week?
I have, I will not be here next Friday either, but then hopefully after that, I should be here more often. We've got all kinds of craziness going on at the organization. And,
okay, otherwise I shall scold you, but okay.
Okay, I am perfectly okay with getting scolded. I'm getting good at it. So no, well, welcome everybody, and please, as we say every week, please use the chat to have conversations, contribute to the community, and to make sure that we are saying correct things, as it turns out. But as always, please make sure they keep it family friendly and germane to the conversation, or at least semi-germane to the conversation. We do like tangents; those are fun. If you do have questions, make sure to put them in Q&A. That's where we like to take questions. It's a lot easier to keep track because this is a loquacious group that uses chat very effectively. So sometimes I miss questions. So make sure you put those in Q&A so that I can have an opportunity to ask your question if I possibly can. And as always, if you do like what we're doing here at the National Council for History Education, please join us. You can visit us on the web at www.ncheteach.org, or you can, of course, visit us on social media at HistoryEd is our handle. We're going to call it handle today. And just real quick, I want everybody, if you could save the dates, August 3rd and 4th, we are doing our second annual Equity Summit virtually, very low cost, and it should be pretty amazing. We have two of our confirmed keynotes right now are really, really phenomenal. So we're very excited about that. So I don't know if we've announced those yet, so otherwise I would tell you who they are. But we are preparing a really great couple of days to think about equity and how we move forward from here. So and with that, I'll turn it over to Joanne, and thank you for being here. This is, as always, wonderful.
Okay, wonderful. I will now, I love following the chat, move it out of the way because I get too tempted to follow along in the chat and I need to focus on you guys. Okay, so I did, as I said at the outset, I want to talk about July 4th. I don't just want to talk about it's a holiday, what's it about, what do we do, it has a long tradition, all of those things will be built in here at some point. But I actually want to talk about some deeper meanings in the holiday, and really, to my mind, what it suggests or shows about the United States sort of in the long term and in specific moments in time. And I suppose in a sense, part of what I'll be talking about, and I'll come back to this shortly, is the idea that from almost the very beginning, from the very beginning, I'll say, and I'll explain this in a moment. From the very beginning, July 4th has always been a combination of commemoration or celebration and conflict. And that because of that, because it's not actually just waving your flag around and being happy, and there are other things built into it, that more accurately reflects what this country is what this country can be, much more interesting and much more meaningful than simply saluting the 4th as a day to sort of thoughtlessly celebrate. You could thoughtlessly celebrate. I totally approve of that. But in addition to that, I'm going to ask you to think a bit about what the holiday suggests, how people have talked about it or used it in the past, what different ways of celebrating it have shown about the nation at that time, and as I just suggested a moment ago, also about the nation in the long term. Now, the very first 4th of July, in a sense, was the 2nd of July. So, and this is a commonly asked question, the Declaration was actually signed in the Second Continental Congress on July 2nd. The reason why we celebrate July 4th is that the document itself was printed off and dated July 4th when it was sent out throughout the colonies about to be nation, to be read aloud, to be discussed, to declare independence broadly. So July 4th, as the date on the document, became the date of official independence. But in truth, July 2nd is the day when independence was declared. So I want to mention two things about that day. First, I'm going to mention, and John Adams is going to be all over this episode, which is very nice because I always feel like he is the Rodney Dangerfield of the founding, who always felt like he never got enough respect. So, and today he will get some respect. So I will have some John Adams appreciation. He wrote, and kind of famously, so I'm guessing that many of you following along may indeed already know this quote, but it must be read anyway. He wrote in 1776, the 2nd day of July, 1776 will be the most memorable epocha in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore. That's for the 18th century. That's some pretty pizzazzy, aggressive language. You will think me transported with enthusiasm. See, what did I tell you? But I am not. I am well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. Yet, through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I'm going to come back to that line in a moment. I can see that the end is more than worth all the means, and that posterity will triumph in that day's transaction, even although we should rue it, which I trust in God we shall not. Now, first of all, I can see the rays of ravishing, through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory, is a line that is sung in 1776, originally a Broadway show, then a movie that probably will be played sometime this weekend. It's sung. Something along the lines of, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. See, what's frightening is that I know that entire movie. Really know that entire movie. But at any rate, what I love sometimes, and this was true sometimes in the Hamilton musical, it's true in 1776, that there are parts of it that are actually taken from 18th century correspondence. And if you can sing 18th century correspondence in a way that is somewhat persuasive and pleasant, that's an accomplishment. But so the point here of this is that Adams really is, sort of saying the day, look at what we're doing on this day. It should be celebrated forever. We don't know if it's going to work out in the end. I pray that it will, but we should be celebrating this day. Oops, and I just lost an earring. So I'm going to be a one earring woman here. Wait a minute, I'm going to take off the other one too, so I will match. Voila. But what's interesting is that not at the same time, later in time, Adams had a slightly different take on that day, July 2nd, 1776, which is also worth mentioning and which will be in line with some of the themes I'm going to be talking about today. Later in his old age, when he's an ex-president, Adams is being, countless people are writing to Adams asking him about the founding and about writing and signing the Declaration and about what it was like. And many of their letters are grounded on this sort of, tell us about the great days of the past and the great founders. So already people are putting founder folk on pedestals. And Adams is very aggressive about trying to knock that down before it really starts. And one of the ways in which he does that is, and I didn't look up the letter before the podcast today, I'm doing this from memory, but it's a striking letter. He writes a letter to someone and he says, you know what? We weren't a bunch of elevated demigod founders. We really weren't. We didn't know what we were doing. And I think I might have mentioned this quote once before on the History Matters, so forgive me if I have, but it fits in right here. He said, I sat there on July 2nd and I watched each man go up to sign that document. And I looked at their faces, and some of them were not really pleased to be signing it. They were not sure it was the right thing to do. They did not necessarily want to be doing it. That was not the moment you imagined that it was. I think that that's a vitally important concept that gets at the heart of some of what I'm going to be talking about this morning, which is, of course, we need holidays to celebrate and values to celebrate and moments to celebrate. So, of course, it makes sense that we do that. But it's important, I think, to do that with realities also in mind, right? That we can celebrate what's worth celebrating while acknowledging things that require thought, things that can be improved, ways where we can move ahead. And that's some of what I'm going to be talking about today. So from that very first 2nd of July, still, on the one hand, Adams is saying there should be lots of celebration. On the other hand, at least according to his memory later in life, he could see on people's faces that they were not all thrilled at signing that document. And that's a far more realistic understanding of the declaring of independence. Now, 1 year later, 1777, Adams actually wrote about what was, in a sense, officially the first celebration of July 4th. And he describes, he's clearly moved by it. He describes, I'll read a couple sentences from him and then describe what to me is the most striking part of the celebration. He says in a letter in 1777, in the evening, I was walking about the streets for a little fresh air and exercise and was surprised to find the whole city lighting up their candles at the windows. I walked most of the evening and I think it was the most splendid illumination I ever saw. A few surly houses were dark, but the lights were very universal. Considering the lateness of the design and the suddenness of the execution, I was amazed at the universal joy and alacrity that was discovered and at the brilliancy and splendor of every part of this joyful exhibition. And he mentions, he forgot to mention the ringing of bells all day and evening and the bonfires in the streets and the fireworks played off. So clearly he's moved, right? There's a little bit of what he suggests in that first 4th of July. He can see people enjoying this moment and it touches him, it moves him. I will note a few things though about this celebration. So first, just based on that paragraph, it's worth noting that bells ringing off and cannons firing and even fireworks, those are not American born. Celebrations for the king often had fireworks and bell ringing. So Americans have a rich history, British history, cultural history, and they're drawing on it in deciding how to celebrate the United States. So even our fireworks are more complicated than they might seem. But what's really striking about this first celebration is not necessarily in that paragraph, but it really struck me about, again, getting beyond the glossy outline of how we assume these celebrations are. A few things took place at that celebration that show how, on the one hand, haphazard it was to celebrate it, and on the other hand, how buried within it was warfare and conflict, even beyond the simple fighting of a war. So there was music playing, apparently, at some point when Adams was walking around. And apparently the music was being played by a band of Hessians who were captured at Trenton. Okay, so there's a band playing, pleasing the people very much. And they were Hessian soldiers fighting for the British captured at the Battle of Trenton, which I just think is so striking and so captures some of the complexity of that moment. Also interesting is the fact that there were troops parading around and a lot of military display. And as far as I can tell, for the most part, the troops were just accidentally there. People were like, well, as long as you're here, how about marching? So Adams in another part of the letter says, two troops of light horse raised in Maryland, accidentally here on their way to camp, were paraded through 2nd Street. So literally, people are like, hey, it's a good day and you're here, and how about marching? And then he says later, after that, about 1,000 infantry now in this city on their march to camp from North Carolina also marched. So literally, they just kind of put something together based on people that happened to be there. They were in the middle of a war, right? So there's a reason why troops are marching around. But from that very beginning, you can see the celebration, you can see the cultural conflict, you can see the ways in which conflict are kind of embedded in the celebration with, in essence, I mean, prisoners of war in a sense, but captured British/Hessian soldiers performing at the 4th of July celebration. It's way more complex and to my mind, way more interesting, and a better way of capturing the complexity of these kinds of celebratory moments. Now, move a little bit forward in time, move to the very beginning of the 19th century. And again, you see this theme of the 4th of July, on the one hand, celebrating unity and celebrating independence and celebrating national accomplishment. And on the other hand, really acting out and embodying conflict. Because what you get as soon as the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans sort of begin in one way or another to cohere, you get, beginning in the, particularly I think in the very early 19th century, competing July 4th celebrations between Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans, in which in one way, both sides are saying, yay, United States, we're celebrating the 4th of July, independence, yippee. So they're doing what you expect them to do. But on the other hand, they're saying, and we're better than those guys who really don't understand the meaning of the 4th. So again, within the first decade of celebrating the 4th of July as a nation, 1800, 1801, 1802, people already have politicized it and are using it to promote their team and attack the other team. Conflict is embedded in how we think about nationhood, and how we think about national identity, and how we think about the founding, and thus how we think about the 4th of July. Now, there are other obvious moments, and I'm going to mention one or two of them. One of them is extremely obvious because it's discussed a lot and for good reason. There are other moments when other people step forward on July 4th, particularly because it's a day of celebration of nationhood, to make a really strong point about the fact that they themselves and people like them are not included in the big we being celebrated on that day, that they're not being treated as equal citizens, that they're not really included as fully privileged Americans that are equal in privileges to everyone else. Two examples of that. One, I'm sure already you're thinking about, and that's the very famous speech made on July 5th, 1852 by Frederick Douglass, who gave a keynote address in Rochester, New York. I'm just going to read a little bit of it. I think most people know the line, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." I'll read a couple other lines to give you a sense of the flavor of it. So he says, "Fellow citizens, I'm not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men too, great enough to give fame to a great age. It does not often happen to a nation to raise at one time such a number of truly great men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, and yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. My business, if I have any here today, is with the present. The accepted time with God and his cause is the ever-living now. Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us?" Really powerful, obviously still known, quoted, still packs the punch it was intended to pack. I mentioned it and I read the passages I read because he does say it's July 4th, and I recognize the fact that something important happened and that the people who did it, there were admirable things about what they did. I will join you in celebrating them. However, let's now talk about the present and brass tack realities. So he himself is doing what I'm really sort of focusing on in my comments today. He himself is saying, I understand the celebration and there should be celebration. There are other things to talk about as well, other things that have a lot to say about who we are as a nation, who the we is that is the nation, and how we can push, or how we should push, to be in a better place. And in a sense, that's what some of the most powerful July 4th moments have been. That's been the message. At this moment of national celebration, this is a moment in which we're thinking about national identity. July 4th and the way we celebrate it, most importantly, say a lot about where we are as a nation, what we're thinking as a nation. They reflect ongoing realities of the moment and how people are thinking about the nation and thinking about however they define patriotism. And that is a really interesting and I think invaluable way of thinking about July 4th. Another example, July 4th, 1876, Susan B. Anthony, she again, and in her case, she wanted, there was a big celebration at an exposition that was done for the centennial of the nation. And she wanted very much to represent women's rights. She was denied a chance to speak at the July 4th celebration, but she was given at least a seat on the podium. And when the moment was right, she actually rose and pushed her way to the platform, in which she was not invited to speak, and spoke and gave a speech. And I'll read just a couple sentences of it here. She says, while the nation is buoyant with patriotism and all hearts are attuned to praise, it is with sorrow we come to strike the one discordant note on this 100th anniversary of our country's birth. Surveying America's exposition, surpassing in magnificence those of London, Paris, and Vienna, shall we not rejoice at the success of the youngest rival among the nations of the earth? May not our hearts in unison with all swell with pride at our great achievements as a people, our free speech, free press, free schools, free church, and the rapid progress we have made in material wealth, trade, commerce, and the inventive arts? And do we rejoice in the success thus far of our experiment in self-government? Yes, is the answer to all of those questions. Yet we cannot forget, even in this glad hour, that while all men of every race and clime and condition have been invested with the full rights of citizenship under our hospitable flag, all women still suffer the degradation of disfranchisement. Again, powerful moment to stand up and make that statement. Equally powerful that she had to fight her way into being given the chance to make it. Two more instances that I want to raise before I'll stop and open things up to question. But they also, both of them, really effectively show how the 4th of July can be celebratory and a reminder of work that needs to be done at the same time. In this case, excuse me, FDR on July 4th, 1941, gives a radio address to the nation. And what I will say, what I'll do is offer links to some of these afterwards that Matt, the all-knowing Matt, can post so that you have access to them. There is online, and I went to find it this morning. There's actually the actual document copy of Roosevelt's speech, or at least part of it, is online, and you can see his edits. Some of them interesting in what he inserted late in the game into this speech. But I'm just going to, again, read you a few lines of what he said. In 1776, on the 4th day of July, the representatives of the several states in Congress assembled, declaring our independence, asserted that a decent respect for the opinion of mankind required that they should declare the reasons for their action. In this new crisis, and he's talking obviously about war, world war, we have a like duty. In 1776, we waged war on behalf of the great principle that government should derive its just powers from the consent of the governed. In other words, representation chosen in free elections. That last sentence, that we should be, the government should derive its powers from representation chosen in free elections. He added that phrase in late in the game, and basically clearly looking at the speech said, got to get more specific here. What we're talking about is free elections in which we choose who represents us. And he then goes on later in the speech to say, it is simple, I could almost say simple-minded, for us Americans to wave the flag, to reassert our belief in the cause of freedom, and to let it go at that. Yet all of us who lie awake at night, all of us who study and study again, know full well that in these days we cannot save freedom with pitchforks and muskets alone. And so it is that when we repeat the great pledge to our country and to our flag, it must be our deep conviction that we pledge as well our work, our will, and if it be necessary, our very lives to defend what America stands for. Now, this speech, he's thinking about the fact that, and he talks at great length about dictatorships all over the world, democracy being attacked all over the world, and the United States standing supposedly as this beacon of democracy, but it can't exist alone as a beacon of democracy when the rest of the world, it's collapsing. Obviously, today we're in a different situation, but the message, again, stands, right? That this is an important day, and it's the perfect day to think about what this nation could be and should be, and to recognize that to get there, we have to work together and act together. And that, have to say it, someone's going to get bingo, that contingency, we're not in a moment when things are ended and have been decided, that at any given moment, and in these particular moments, there's contingency, and particularly the people doing the speaking are saying, this isn't decided yet, and it shouldn't be decided. There's room for improvement, but it's not going to happen by itself. We have to work for it. So you can see how in all of these cases, the fourth embodies celebration and commemoration and some realistic weighing of realities and problems and shortcomings and ways in which there must be improvement to achieve some of the ideals, at least referenced in some way in the founding project, if not really understood in the way they come to later be understood. The Declaration of Independence was written in a specific, precise moment in historical time, and at that moment, there were their own precise ways of thinking about who counts as a citizen, women, African Americans, enslaved people. In that moment in time, what they were thinking of when they thought of equity and freedom and rights does not equal in any way what we ideally are thinking about now. But that said, and I've said this before on History Matters as well, that ideals that are opened as possibilities, even if not understood that way by the people who did the opening, those are important. And you could see in all of these speeches that I've cited, you can see people, in a sense, taking up that flag, taking up the idea that there are possibilities that haven't been achieved yet, but that it's not hopeless. They might be achieved, but we have to act for it. We have to work for it. That's a really important message. And I think that's just as important, if not more important, today, when we are at a moment when democracy is being challenged here and all over the world, when it's in peril, when it's unclear what's going to happen, moment of extreme contingency, as I've said 100,000 times, but it is. And in this moment, when we step back to think about the nation and what it represents, and to celebrate the fact that it's here, it is only fitting that we also join to recognize the fact that there needs to be improvement, that we can work for something better, and that to do both of those things at the same time is possible. You don't need to just praise without acknowledging the need for change and the shortcomings. They're part of the same package. Anyone who wants to tell the history of America without the conflict, without the struggle, without the shortcomings, is not telling the history of America. America isn't just golden happiness. America is about conflict and struggle and striving. Always has been. Different people doing the striving and taking part in the struggle, but one way or another, from the very beginning, there is conflict embedded in America's celebration of its founding as a nation, its Declaration of Independence. That is as it should be, and it's something that we should all bear in mind this July 4th and really every July 4th, but particularly July 4th this year, next year, and in the next few years to come. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to open things up for questions, although, of course, I know that I'm going to move chat. Carolee is now yelling mug again. Tom said mug. Okay, you guys are mixing it up today. Thank you, Carolee. Carolee said, but right. I mean, this is anyway. Okay, so my mug for today is a bit of a stretch, except it wasn't. So I went looking, and again, anyone here who is new, every episode, I try to find a mug that has something to do with the topic under discussion. I went into my mug cabinet, could not find a really explicitly July 4th mug, but I came close. So I will show it first, and then I will explain what it is. So it says, July 9th, 2016, took my shot. It's a mug commemorating Lin-Manuel Miranda's last performance as Hamilton, which was on July 9th, and which is why the front of the mug says, "One last time." So it was as close as I could come, but July 9th, I think that's pretty good.
Pretty good. That's pretty good.
And I will show one other thing, which I don't normally do, but I did it for you today, and that is I'm wearing an appropriate T-shirt.
Excellent.
For the occasion. I'm not going to stand up because I'll just be like displaying my breast to the world. So I'll lift it up. It is High Noon on the
High
Hudson.
Noon at the Hudson. Oh my gosh, I want that.
It's a Burr Hamilton duel July 11th T-shirt.
Okay,
so I'm having a commemorative July moment here, not July 4th, but I love this shirt, and it's I can't even read, but it goes on like one of those, Sunday kind of announcement. Time to settle the score. 10 paces live from the dueling grounds, Weehawken, New Jersey. So it's a classic. So anyway, okay.
Okay, somebody find that shirt because I want one.
I don't remember. I've had it for a while. I don't know when I got it, but you don't see them all the time. So you now can, now look at that.
They're there. Thank you.
Within a nanosecond, Carolee and Emily are like, here's the shirt. It's a great shirt. Okay.
That is a great shirt. I'm going to order one today.
Matt, okay.
Oh, yes.
I don't know, were people guessing?
I did not see any guesses, but I also was looking down a little bit. So I had my gigantic head in the way, but I went with the birthplace of Francis Scott Key. This is what is it called?
I would not have guessed that, and I did not see that when you moved your head, so I don't know if anyone else did.
Did anybody else catch that?
I'm looking.
Yeah, I went back and forth. There's a couple, but I thought we're gonna go with the Francis Scott Key is what was stuck in my head, so I went ahead with Francis Scott Key, the birthplace of Francis Scott Key this week. So
I think that makes perfect sense. I think July 4th peripheral moments, because obviously it's in line with what I talked about today, which is
exactly
other things matter besides flag waving on July 4th, and Matt and I have just embodied this. Look at me like riffing. I'm riffing, but we have just embodied the fact that there are all of these things around the holiday that are pegged into the holiday as well.
Sorry, I have to scroll up and like find that T-shirt so that I can actually look.
Oh yes, I'm yes.
Put on a new message.
I'm sure you can find it too. So there, Lindsay is also a new highlight. Yeah, people are basically saying they think that's your new house.
Yes. We love it. When I say I'm into history, I really go all out. I
love the fact that you were momentarily speechless, though. That was good.
It very rarely happens.
Yeah.
Much to my wife's chagrin. Okay, we got not lots of questions. People put in questions. Nobody wants to suffer through my questions.
Okay.
So, Tom, what is our selection of 7/4/1776 as the capital letters day the nation began say about us? Mortimer Adler thought it should have been the date associated with victory in the War of Independence or the Articles of Confederation, or maybe even 1787. Many anti-racist activists would prefer 1619. What does it say about that particular day?
Well, I think it says a couple of things. There's a book called Celebrating the 4th by Len Travers, which talks about these early American competitive July 4th celebrations. But one of the things he says in that book is that the fact that, and in his case, he's saying the fact that we celebrate on July 4th and not July 2nd shows how paper-minded we are, that it's the paper that made it official. And so when it's out on the paper, that's when people are like, okay, now it's a holiday. So we celebrate the official document, not the actual commission of the act. And at some point, I think I've talked before about how we are a document-minded people, right? Colonies come with charters. Colonial governments are small. Americans have a sense of their rights, partly for that reason. These are small, intimate governments, that we've always been a little bit of a paper/charter-minded people. So in part, I think that's some of what this says. I also think it says something about the fact that we're really excited about foundings, and by that I mean beginnings. And the 4th of July is like a grand beginning. And it's a grand beginning that seemingly, and this does not include what I just talked about today, that seemingly is just joyous. We have won independence. Now, of course, we haven't won independence. We just declared it. It wasn't won yet. And Adam says that in his statements, right? We haven't gotten there yet. I hope we don't like actually get sorry for the fact that we're doing what we did today. But I think it has to do also with our celebrations of foundings and our desire for that kind of celebration, which is natural, that you don't necessarily want to have all the complications. I also think it might be problematic, maybe more problematic, to celebrate a military, yay, there was a military surrender, yippee. I think that probably there is an assumption that by celebrating a legislative act that resulted in a document that was explicitly written to have a kind of, I don't want to say democratic, patriotic or nationalistic poetry to it, declaring the sentiment behind the declaring of independence, that makes that moment sort of resonate as the important moment. So I think the very shorthand of that is it has to do with the document. Mm-hmm. And even though Jefferson said, what I wrote in that document was largely what was circulating at the time. It wasn't like I sat down and made up this whole new theory of things. I was putting on paper ideas that already people basically had. So it's the document and what it captures about what people felt about the founding at that moment that makes logical sense, that if you're looking for a commemorative holiday, that would be the moment that already has its kind of anthem, even before Francis Scott Key, in the document itself, in the opening to the document, right? Because we've always, as a nation, focused much more on the opening than on the actual heart of the document, which is the he has, right? The heart of the document, the important part, was all of the things the kings had done to justify declaring independence. That's always been the part that Americans are like, yeah, whatever. But when in the course of human events, that's the part that we celebrate. That's important to remember too, that even from the beginning, even the document itself is not just the opening paragraph. It's a combination of a grand principle and then brass tack ground level realities of complaints that people have about how they were being governed by the British.
And that actually leads incredibly well into Dale's question. So, which is, given that words matter and while we're celebrating, what part of the Declaration of Independence do you think was the most noteworthy and important when it was written? And would that choice change with the threats that democracy faces today?
Well, this doesn't quite answer, I think, the question you're asking, but I'm going to say it anyway because I think it's important. One of the important things that happened was the struggle over what to say about slavery in the document. And the fact that the original document somehow or other had attacking the king for bringing enslaved people to the colonies and then attacking the king for freeing enslaved people to use during warfare. It didn't fully make sense what was in that document about slavery. And then that in and of itself was contested. And then that much of that language was struck out of the document. In a way, that's talking about from the very beginning. So from the moment that Americans were like, we are declaring ourselves an independent nation, let's struggle about slavery, right? That moment is there at the founding moment. That's there. So that, I might say, is in many ways the most important aspect of that accomplishment, that moment in time. On the other hand, I also think when in the course of human events, I think the idea of for the people at the time, placing the American struggle in this broad scheme, that what was happening in the United States, or what was hopefully going to happen in the United States, had a broader significance, and that it mattered what happened in the United States. Sometimes people have taken that too far and assumed that that happens in the United States matters more than anything else in the world. And it's natural, I suppose, for some people to assume that in the United States. I think that's in the global world that we live in right now. I don't think that it's very easy, or should be very easy, to think that. But I think that idea of that the United States is playing a role, or what will be the United States is playing a role and is now taking its place in world events, that was a sort of psychologically important nationalistic moment at the beginning too.
So we're short on questions. So again, I apologize,
Uh-oh.
but I will ask, and I'm gonna apologize in advance because I actually did step away for 2 seconds to deal with something. So I hope you didn't actually talk about this, but one of the things that that might be of interest to people is what happened between July 2nd and July 4th behind the scenes with the founders. As you mentioned earlier, like some of them were not super thrilled about signing it. What kind of negotiations, what does history tell us about those? Because that's a lot of time to, sit in pubs drinking and talking politics. So
Well, but it also was necessary time to like set the type in place,
right.
print the documents, and because the assumption was, and there's a book called by Jay Fliegelman called Declaring Independence, and the title says it all. It's about the fact that declaring independence was an act, and it was always assumed to be an act. So from the very beginning, it wasn't seen as just a piece of paper, although the piece of paper had to exist and be widely distributed. But declaring independence was seen as an act. It was seen as something that you were doing, not just as a nation, but as a people. And so they were sending these documents all over the place so that Americans everywhere could hear it. It was being read aloud.
Mhm.
So that in a sense, by taking part in the reading of it and hearing it, Americans were engaging in the act of declaring independence. So I think that's a large part of in other words, the printing and the creation of the document, as much as that may seem like sort of peripheral, I think ends up being a huge aspect of the importance of what was going on in that moment, because that was the moment when independence, in essence, was being, I suppose you could say, nationalized, right? That independence was being, the idea of it was being spread, and it was being made a popular event, a popular moment. Fliegelman's book has a really interesting theory in it. He looks at the original, one of the original first printed copies, and he notices what appeared to be phonetic markings above some of the words, and he wonders whether that initial document actually had markings about how it was to be read aloud. So that's the degree to which it was seen as a performance of independence, not just a statement of independence. It's a really interesting book. It's a very quirky book, and I assign it very often to my graduate classes, and people either love it or really, really don't like it. I think it's a really creative book, and it inspired me in a lot of ways with my first book, but it's worth taking a look at, Declaring Independence.
Do we have any? Okay, there are some questions coming in. I'm gonna have to read. So I'm gonna ask this question, and then I will ask other people's questions. So we talked a lot today about sort of famous founding fathers, I guess is the best way to put it. Like, do we have anything from less well-known founding fathers? And I'm going to pick one just because it's in my head and it is a literal thing, is Josiah Bartlett, which, because we mentioned West Wing earlier.
Yes.
But like these people that ended up not being part of sort of the grandmaster narrative, or in they're mentioned in one section of the history book, and that's maybe about it. So I wondered, do we have reflections from those folks, and how does that differ from sort of the mainstream, or
well, I'm gonna,
or maybe even women at the time that were sort of peripheral to this?
well, so I'm going to go even beneath the sort of minor league sort of founder folk that are implied in that question, and go to and the name went right out of my head. What is the name, you guys will know, of Pauline Mayer's book that she wrote about the Declaration of Independence? Someone knows it out there. It's driving me crazy. At any rate, someone will come up with it. But at any rate, Pauline Maier wrote a wonderful book about the Declaration of Independence. And she has a chapter in the book titled The Other Declarations. American Scripture. Thank you, Matthew and Vicky. Okay, that is it. American Scripture. It's a great book. And I use that one in teaching a lot too. There's a chapter in it, and this is the chapter I tend to use, called The Other Declarations. And the point that she makes is that when independence was being discussed, it wasn't just being discussed in the Second Continental Congress, that there were town meetings and discussions going on throughout the colonies, and that people in those meetings were drawing up statements about what they thought about whether independence should be declared or not. So that in essence, the American people created other declarations. It was more national and more, well, national, it's not quite a nation yet, but it is sort of more widespread and a more popular in the sense of engaged in by masses of people moment than our image of a bunch of guys in, breeches and tights in a room signing a document might suggest. That what I love about that chapter and about that image is that Americans all over the United States were grappling with the realities of independence and what they thought of it. And you can see that in the statements that they draw up, that they were really seriously considering what it meant. Again, contingency, right? It wasn't as though everyone said, yippee, independence, I'm on board. They were thinking about what it meant. They were worrying about what might happen. You can see all of that in these other declarations. So I highly recommend that as a way to get at what is underlying this question. It's a really good question.
Gloria wanted to know how you feel about the second sentence of the Declaration of Independence. Was it a period or a comma? I'm referring to Danielle Allen's thesis.
And you're going to have to read that to me because I can't. It's not in front of me.
It says, how do you feel about the second sentence? Was it a period or a comma? I'm referring to Danielle Allen's thesis is the question. The line, of course, is we hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created.
Yeah.
They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights.
Yeah, whether let's see. We have I'm reading from a PBS thing here. It says there's an actual question of typography in a very famous line, whether it is often seen as a period. We have it here is actually a comma. That's right. It says the second sentence of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and then several clauses, and I think that's what the question is.
So the question is should it be a period after self-evident?
I believe that's the correct. That's yes.
Huh. I guess I'm missing the significance of that because it's still okay. The phrases that follow are very clearly intended to be these truths. So, but I'm sure that Danielle Allen had a significance to it that I'm missing here in the question. So if you guys have a different way of asking the question, send it along and I'll be happy to.
Excellent. That's kind of how I was feeling about it, but I wanted to throw that out there in case you knew something I did not. So.
Button, and I will say Button, I don't know if it's Gwinnett or Gwinnett, but Button Gwinnett died young in a duel. And his signature is, I think, the most valuable of any signer of the Declaration, only because there aren't that many of them. So, or at least one of the most valuable, but died in a duel. So and as a kid, I was like, oh, there's another duelist there. But yeah, there was Stephen Colbert did like a musical about Button to make fun of Hamilton. So anyway, I'm sorry, go on with the questions. Gloria raised her hand, but has not asked it, I think, in Q&A.
Danielle Allen said it was about the common good, not individual rights, is what Gloria wrote in the Q&A.
Oh, yes. Well, yes. So, and that's an important thing to bear in mind too, that when we think of rights, particularly nowadays, I think people think of individual rights. And the fact of the matter is that is not necessarily always the way that they've been understood, and that group rights, the rights of us as a people, or the rights of Americans, or the rights of some Americans and not other Americans, that there was a groupness, that it was about rights of we, right? And which is why, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution is we the people. It isn't, when you look at something like, I'm going to say the daring thing, right? The Second Amendment, the First Amendment, it isn't simply saying when it was written, every individual has the right to have a gun. It's saying, well, we as a people need to have the right to protect ourselves if necessary. There's a broader meaning. And over the years, as with so much that has to do with, we're now talking about the Constitution and not the Declaration, but in both cases, as I sort of started out by saying, over time, in different historical moments, we use those documents and interpret those documents and sometimes warp those documents in ways that reflect the moment. A striking example of this, and I didn't mention it, I had it written down and I didn't mention it during my comments, was I'm sure some of you remember a few years ago when NPR was tweeting the Declaration of Independence, and some people, oops, I keep banging the table with my knee. Some people got very angry because they didn't know it was a declaration and they assumed it was an attack on former President Trump, which to me, if you want to look at a way in which the Declaration and how we discuss it or celebrate it shows you the moment that we're in, that's boop, right in front of your face, right? It's a document that people didn't recognize, and a lot of people might not recognize it. And not only did they not recognize it, but they assumed it was a partisan political attack. I think people at the time called it propaganda. It's like, well, we could argue about whether it was meant to be propaganda at the beginning, but that says so much. I think that was 2017. That says so much about the moment that we're in. If I were writing a book along the lines of some of what I've been discussing here, that might get its own chapter because it says so much about where we are.
Well, we only have time for a couple more questions, so I'm going to throw some easy ones at you.
Okay.
I'm kidding. They're not easy ones.
Darn.
Kathleen would like you to discuss or define patriotism historically and how it's evolved over into today.
Wow. That's an easy question.
Yeah, I'm here to help. I'm a helper.
You are. That's always helpers. Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Well, I think my difficulty with answering that is that there is no one meaning, and there never has been any one meaning, and that there are so many major ideas and buzzwords in American history that can be interpreted in many ways, which is their power and their weakness, right? That on the one hand, you can say things like liberty, freedom, words that we all, celebrate, and then you can start to attack what they mean and look at what isn't included or insist what is included. And that it's why those words have a kind of power, is that you can manipulate them in that kind of a way. It's why, as a teacher, and I'm sure I must have mentioned this at some point, I tell my undergrads in my courses that they're not allowed to use democracy in their papers. And by democracy, I mean liberty, freedom, independence, and throw those words around as though they have a concrete meaning, which even at the time they didn't, and they certainly don't now. So, yesterday I did an interview, I guess for Texas Public Radio, and they wanted me to talk about words, the words we use to describe January 6th matter. It's the 6 months after it happened, and they're doing something about what people's thoughts now 6 months after the fact. What they wanted me to talk about was the fact that words matter, which of course I was very happy to do, because they do in a lot of ways, right? It almost feels as flip as saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, words matter. But it has such a deeper meaning, because the words that people use for things allow us to, or sometimes compel us to understand things or think about things in certain ways, present realities in certain ways and block out other realities. They shape our thinking, and I definitely have talked about this many times before, potentially arouse emotion. So the words that we use sometimes can define realities. They really matter in a lot of ways. And I think that's true in founding documents, even though there is no word that across all of human time has always had the same meaning. I'm sure many of you out there have done this, but it's one of the first things I do when I start a project and I'm looking at wording, is to go to the Oxford English Dictionary and to look to see, in the year I'm looking at, roughly how did people use the word? Because a huge percentage of the time it's in a way that I never would have anticipated. And that's a really easy way of looking at what I'm saying here, which is that words are important. Words shape realities, and there is no one reality associated with a word, which is part of the broader sort of flexibility and some of the ambiguities of history and how we understand history overall.
Well, let's end with, by the way, Dale, Charles, thanks for that last question that just popped in. We will tackle that in after party, but Dale was killing it with questions today. So I'm actually asking 2 Dale questions, which is rare for me.
Dale always asks good questions.
He really does. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But this one is particularly good. A good way to end, which is the idea of America, the light that represented the change from darkness on the continent at the time. Is that idea alive and well today? America being the light that represented change from darkness, quote unquote.
I think that in the 18th century, that was how they thought about it, right? It was a new thing in the world. They were going to spread the spark of liberty around the globe. Now Nubia is suddenly peeping. He has a lot to say on this. I think we can't say such things in such an uncomplicated way now. I think in a global age, we can say that there are aspects of the American nation that are admirable and that are worth celebrating. We can also say that there are aspects of where we are that are in sync with some of what's happening in the rest of the world and are not so admirable. So, is America the great light? I don't think there is one great light. I think it is a great light, but it wavers sometimes. I think I've said this before in print. I think that assuming unquestioningly that America is exceptional to every rule, it's better than every country, it's distinct and alone in and of itself, and it can never go wrong, is wrong and is dangerous. That's the anti-contingency message, right? That's just like, well, we're always the best, we're always great, and it's always going to be good. We're living in a moment when that's just not true. There are things about America and what it represents that are wonderful, but they're not necessarily eternal. And they don't stand alone. That's some of what FDR was saying in what I read, that message. He's saying that whatever we are, we don't stand alone. We may be a country that is really speaking out in favor of some liberties that a lot of other people aren't, but the fact of the matter is the rest of the world has to be in league, in sync with what we're thinking for this ever to work in any way at all. So we live in a moment, and the pandemic is the ultimate example of this, when globalism, you can't escape it. COVID does not recognize boundaries of any kind. Mm-hmm. It's a global pandemic, and that really shows you precisely where we are. That's where we are, is in a world suffering from a pandemic, in a world suffering from a climate crisis. We don't stand alone as a nation, and shouldn't. We need to, I always talk about the national we. We need to have a world we to deal with some of the questions that we're dealing with now. I don't know if we're doing so well at that, but we need to think that way. There's a big, broad way to end.
That's a nail biter to end on, but I know. To stop. I think that's.
At any rate, I'm not quite sure where you guys have gone in your conversation, because I tuned out, but I know you're going into all kinds of interesting places. I will say, as always, thank you guys for coming. Thank you for allowing this kind of discourse, this kind of conversation to happen every week. People can ask questions, we talk about things, we process things, I learn things from you, we figure things out together. It is important. It's why I'm here every week, and it's why you're here every week, and it's why Matt is here every week. So it matters. And on this approach to July 4th, it particularly matters. We are a group of people who think about history and understand that the complexity of history matters. And as I said in my comments today, on July 4th, we should consider and actually embrace that complexity as we look ahead. Now, we are going to segue into the after party. For those of you who are new, what that means is that we will no longer be recording what we are doing here. So we will stop recording and we will move into a different kind of discussion, which is more fluid and more open and more informal, and we can talk about whatever we want to do. Oops, I'm really smashing the table with my knee this time. And is always enjoyable. If you already have joined us online through the NCHE website, ncheteach.org, facebook.com/conversations, you're in. All you have to do is stay here. If you're on Facebook and are watching on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and join us through ncheteach.org/conversations, and then you will be in the after party poof. So it's open to everyone, but you can't join automatically from Facebook. In the meantime, see you guys next week when I will hopefully figure out what we're going to talk about before Thursday, but I don't know if that's going to happen. I'm starting to give in, but we will know by the time we see each other next week what the heck I'm going to talk about, because you never know what's in the news.
Well, thanks everybody, and we will see you next week.
Time for the after party. Poof.